Very happy to see you all here. And before I introduce our very distinguished guest from Tel Aviv, Professor Victor Vakhshtayn, I want to say a couple of things about the seminar. First of all, my name is Maxim Schreier. I'm a professor of Russian, English, and Jewish studies at Boston College, and I direct the seminar on Russian and Eurasian Jews here at the Davis Center. And it's one of our longstanding seminars, and I'm very happy that it is continuing. The seminar this year has been focusing on questions of Jewish memory in lands and communities with roots and in Russia and Eurasia. And we had a great event back in October when Professor Catherine Lebo of Oxford spoke of the Jewish elements in Solidarność, the Solidarity movement. Some of you probably know that one of the leaders of the Solidarity movement was Marek Edelman, one of the survivors and the last leader of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. So that was a great talk. Today we'll have, I'm sure, a wonderful talk by Victor about the legendary Teodor Shanin. But I also want to highlight a couple of events we're planning for the spring. So I'm hoping that in February, we will have Isabella Tabarovsky of the Wilson Center, who will be talking about her new book, which is about Soviet anti-Zionism and its heirs on the present scene. And then in April, I hope we will welcome Leona Toker of Hebrew University, who will be speaking about Julius Margolin, Yuri Margolin, and his memoir, Путешествие в страну ЗК, A Journey to the Land of the ZK, and his other literary works. I'm really looking forward to these events, but before I formally introduce Victor, I also want to say that we have several sponsors. One is the sponsor that we collaborate with frequently, the Center for Jewish Studies here at Harvard, and I want to thank them. I also want to thank the Scholars Without Borders program here at the Davis Center and one of its leaders, Dan Epstein, and of course our colleagues here at the Davis Center, and several of them are here, Laura Sargent and Chris Martin. So now the best part, which is when you introduce the speaker, and I'm really thrilled that we made this happen and that Victor Vakhshtayn is here, not by Zoom, but in person. He is a renowned sociologist. He graduated from the Department of Psychology at Penza University and then earned his master's degree in social sciences at the Russian British University in Moscow. He received his PhD in social theory from the Higher School of Economics and served as professor of sociology and dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences at Shaninka, and I'm known to confuse Shaninka and Wyshka, so I'll say that this is the Moscow School of Social and Economic Sciences, right? So Victor is the author of 9 books and over 150 articles, and has twice been included in the list of the 100 most cited Russian-speaking sociologists. In September 2021, following the arrest of colleagues and a raid by the Russian Federal Security Service, Vakhshtayn left Russia, perhaps fled from Russia, says is better, and he joined the board of the Teodor Shanin International Foundation and became one of the founders of the first Russian university in exile. This is the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Sciences. The abbreviation is FLAS, based in Montenegro, created by former Russian British University faculty. Victor is currently professor and head of the Department of Sociology at FLAS. Since January 2022, he has been living in Israel, where he serves as a senior research fellow at the Center for Russian Studies at Tel Aviv University, which I think has benefited tremendously from the so-called fifth wave of the fifth wave of immigration, or the sort of most recent Aliyah. Right, exactly. We know that too. And I might add that in Israel, Victor had his debut as a writer of nonfiction, and I just want to showcase this book, which came out in Tel Aviv, with Bible publishers, the publishers of the Bible bookstore, which, by the way, has emerged as one of the leading Russian language publishers since the outbreak of the war in Ukraine. This is a book of nonfiction called Smog, and Victor will be reading from this book on Saturday at Boston College as part of the Michael B. Krebs Memorial Readings in Emigre Russian Literature. Victor, we're thrilled to have you, and Professor Vakhshtayn is going to speak about the 5 worlds of Teodor Shanin. Welcome.
Thanks so much. Thanks a lot. And first of all, good evening, dear colleagues. Let me express my deep gratitude and appreciation for the invitation to my friends and colleagues from Davis Center. It's a great honor and pleasure for me to be here today. So the story I'd like to tell you, it's a partly biographical story because it's about Professor Teodor Shanin and his autobiography published both in Russian and in English recently. Partly the story is institutional and political one, because I'm going to talk about the Moscow School of Social and Economic Sciences, also known as Shaninka, the Russian-British University in Moscow, established by Teodor Shanin. But above all, it's going to be a very personal story, because Teodor was my teacher. I served as a dean at the university he established for almost 14 years, and he was a very close friend of mine for more than 10 years. So let me start with this personal side. And I will start not from the beginning, but from the end. On September 28th, I woke up at 6 a.m. In my apartment in Moscow to the persistent knocking by the door by 2 Federal Security Service officers who came to visit me with a warrant for interrogation and search of my apartment. At that time, I lived this, I don't know how to say it in English, we call it attic apartment, attic flat. So it took them approximately 15 minutes to break through 2 doors to get into the apartment. It took me a little bit less than 10 minutes to get dressed, to pick up my emergency backpack, prepared specially for this kind of scenarios, to go on the roof through the kitchen window, climb to the next attic apartment, to leave the house from the entrance from the building, another entrance from the building. And that was the last day when I was in Russia, 4 years ago, luckily. So the same day I knew that this morning FSB officers also visited the rector of my university, the vice rector, and the head of legal department. They were all arrested, and all deans and heads of schools and the departments were interrogated and pressured to testify against them and against each other. So it was a very busy morning for Federal Security Service. That was the beginning of the end of the Moscow School. During the next few months, some of us were announced as foreign agents. I'm officially declared a foreign agent in April 2022. I was accused in destroying Russian traditional values by the means of sociological research. I still don't know what does it mean. I think they have some kind of textbook in sociology where it says that there are 3 types of sociological methods: qualitative, quantitative, and anti-Russian. I need to go a little bit deeper. I don't know about this too much. So, but probably the most traumatic moment of this period was the severe media campaign that was launched in Russian state-controlled media, which by that time, it means in all Russian media, where one name was mentioned especially often. The name of the person who was responsible for conspiracy in the center of Moscow, the person who built a nest of Western spies, Jewish liberals, and national traitors. So the person is Teodor Shanin. And today I will talk a little bit who was Teodor Shanin and what he did. By that time, he was already a year and a half passed away. So not good to say it, but thanks God, he didn't witness it. So Teodor Shanin was born in, yeah, this is the Moscow school. This is the nest of spies and Jewish liberals. I think that's how it's supposed to work, right? He was born in Polish Vilna, in a Jewish, wealthy, upper middle class family in October 1930s. His parents were from very prominent families in Vilna. His father, Mayor Zaichnur, was a businessman and political activist and philanthropist. He was one of the founders of Yiddish-speaking newspaper. He was also very active, a lot of publications in Yiddish, in Der Weg, in Zionistische Stimme, and also one of the leaders of so-called general Zionists movement. So in the current political situation, I guess it's would be considered as a very centrist Zionist movement, which means it's not Marxist. But by that time, general Zionists were considered right-wing Zionists. Right? Today we have a bit different understanding of what right-wing means. So his mother was from Misnaged family. I don't know, do we have any specialists in Jewish heritage? So I will say very shortly what's Misnagedim are. It's a Jewish sect, let's call it this way, within Judaism, who praise intellectualism, rationalism, reading texts, interpreting texts. So they were really opposed to Hasidic movement, because they were more about social justice, ethics, and spiritual understanding of the world. So the grandfather of Teodor, father of Rebecca Yashunska, his mother, was the only religious person in this family, but he refused to wear a kippah, a yarmulke, because he said, show me the part of Torah when it says that I need to wear it. If you can't show me that and you can't prove me with argumentation, I'm not going to wear it anyway. When he was arrested and he was in Polish prison for a short time, all his Catholic Polish co-prisoners, co-inmates, believed that he was a saint because he refused to eat and he was giving a food to other people in this prison. But the reason was quite simple, it was not kosher. But for Polish inmates, it was a sign of a saint person that he is refusing to eat in such conditions. So, interesting enough that Teodor, from this kind of family, his native language was Polish, and his father was a prominent Yiddish writer, never spoke Yiddish to his son because he wanted him to speak Hebrew, so because he was general Zionist. So Teodor had to learn Yiddish much later. It was also interesting distinction there because Yiddish was a language of working class, Jewish working class in Vilna, and bourgeois family, they, especially Zionistic bourgeois family, of course, they prefer to speak Polish and Hebrew. That's why Teodor attended a Tarbut school, Hebrew school, from the childhood. In his book, you can find a lot of interesting distinctions, how this kind of distinctions between Polish and Jewish community was reproduced, but also how class distinctions were reproduced. I think that first sociological observation Teodor made when he was 6 years old, when he brought from school his classmates. And I love this way of writing. Our household staff was not particularly pleased, but no one dared to object. So he observed that his classmates cannot stand on the parquet floor because you need to have very special body habits to deal with this kind of parquets. So I think that's what Pierre Bourdieu called habitus in sociological language. I'm not sure that at 6 years old, Teodor was already a Bourdieusian sociologist, but he definitely could use the concept. So the first world of Teodor, pre-war Vilna, he has a lot of nostalgic memories about this period in his book, and he always loved to talk about Vilna before the war. That period for him ended up when he was 9 years old, when war started. But they preferred to make a lot of fun about this event. When Vilna became a Lithuanian city, they were joking that Lithuanians are not very eager to take Vilna because the only Lithuanian tank driver had caught a cold. But jokes were over very soon. In June 1941, Teodor, and that's why he's Teodor, not Theodore, was named after Theodor Herzl, of course. His younger sister, Alinka, was actually named Aliyah, also a very Zionist name for a girl. So when his father was arrested for being a nationalistic politician, which means a Zionist politician, soldiers who were sent from Russia and Canada soldiers wanted to save his daughter, his younger sister. And they said, you know, you're going to Siberia now, and your older boy probably will survive it, but your girl is not going to make it. So if you have someone where you can leave her, just leave her with your father. And that's what they did. Father of the mother of Theodor, his granddad, he refused to evacuate. He said, you know, I remember Germans from the previous war. We can make a deal with them. He couldn't make a deal with them. So Theodor's sister and his grandfather were killed as soon as Vilna was occupied by Nazis. The irony is that Theodor's life and life of his mother and life of his father were saved because they were arrested by Soviet forces. Father was in prison and they were sent to Siberia. Wait a second. That was the second world of Teodor Shanin. First, he was exiled and deported together with his mother to Altai, right? Altaiskaya Oblast. He never before traveled so far, especially to Siberia. And Siberian peasants who were helping them to survive also never seen Jews from Vilna before. And when they just stepped out from the train, people from local village were thrilled because they have never seen kids in shorts, especially in Siberia. And they were trying to make sense of what they saw. And of course, all kids, like good Jewish boys in Vilna, they were all wearing shorts. So local people from Altai village decided that communists stole his pants. That was the conclusion of Concilium. So that was the first anthropological practicum for Teodor Shanin. For him, anthropology and ethnography, and he traveled almost 100 countries in his life, working in Brazil in very different environments, including Iran, by the way. For him, he said ethnography was not something you are doing for fun. It was a matter of survival. So that's how he became ethnographer, I think. From Altai Oblast, they moved to Samarkand. The reason they moved exactly to Samarkand was because Teodor read a leaflet, I believe it was a book, called Samarkand Gorod Khlebny. Samarkand as a bread capital of Soviet Union. Help me with translation. I don't know how to say. So he said, Mom, there is plenty of bread there. Let's go there. They knew nothing about Samarkand except of that phrase when they moved there. But then Polish citizens were free to go. The family reunited. They came back, reunited with the father. They came back to Vilna. They were trying to find a sister and family. Everybody was killed. And they decided to move to Lodz. So by that time, that was the first really bad conflict between Teodor and his father, because his father was a very Zionistic guy, but not to the extent to go to Palestine. Like it was very, very wealthy Zionism of Lithuanian, of Polish wealthy family. But for Teodor, after all those years, he was already 16 years old, it was the only wish to go to Palestine to fight for Jewish state, for the creation of Jewish state. So he was one of the leaders of underground Jewish group in Poland, in Lodz. The first thing they were doing, they were looking for Jewish orphans, because some Jewish parents managed to leave their children to Christian families in order to save them. And those Christian families were not happy to give kids back after that. So it was very violent and very morally problematic situation. The second thing, of course, learning Hebrew. And the third, organization of illegal immigration to Palestine. And in April 1948, with the forged documents, future professor Teodor Shanin started his journey to Palestine. It was already the outbreak of War for Independence, Arab-Israeli War, 1948. He passed exam when he managed to get to Haifa, and not answering the question when he was named after his real name, like Ayuz Zaitchnor, and he said he didn't say anything, pretending that he doesn't know what does it mean. So that's how he decided to change his name, by the way. But he did it much later. And that's how he became a soldier of Gdud Shesh, the 6th Legion of Palmach Brigade. So he was fighting, it was called Gdud Yerushalayim. They were fighting for Jerusalem, bringing food to Jerusalem that was sieged at that time. That was third world of Teodor Shanin.
Which one was he? In that picture.
This one. I never seen Teodor with hair, actually. That's why for me it's also hard to recognize him pictured. No, this is not, he's not on this picture, it's just a picture of the 6th Legion. There's plenty of jokes about this period. He was young, he was fighting for what he believed in. He was really loyal to Palmach. Palmach was a very interesting brigade. They consist of mainly people who were born in Palestine, the first generation always there. And that was a mixture of people who were born there and people who came after the Holocaust. And one of the stories he told me about this period, when he was a soldier on Jerusalem front, in Latrun. Fight for Latrun was probably the most, it was a terrible bloodshed, and Israeli forces lost Latrun battle. And a lot of his friends were killed there. And we had the conversation when I was appointed as a dean. I said, okay, I'm gonna go, I was 27 years old. I said, okay, I'm ready to become a dean. I don't know what does it mean, but I'm ready. but only if you will come back to teaching. If you're going to be a professor in my department, okay. So that was a deal. And Teodor was teaching sociology of knowledge. And one day we had a discussion with our students in class about Wittgenstein and Wittgensteinian approach to sociology of knowledge, which is pretty much non-reflexive knowledge, not knowledge at hand, but knowledge in hand. And we were discussing that practical knowledge concept. After the class, I came to his apartment because we were living close to each other. And we kept discussing it. And he said, you know what? I saw how Wittgenstein was the reason for so many good guys to die. I was like, tell me more about Wittgensteinian disease, what's happened? And he said, you know, when we were fighting for Latrun, half of my brigade was Sabrin, people who were born there, and half were Yekis. Yeah, but that's a pejorative, and they used it not only for German-speaking Jewry, mostly Germans, but my grandparents from Chernovitz, we are Yekis for him as well. Of course, and a lot of jokes about Yekis in Palmach. One of them is when they're trying to build something and they need to pass stones. You know this? Like, danke schön, bitte schön, danke schön, bitte schön. That's why it takes longer time. So going back to Wittgenstein, so he said, we had instruction what to do. You need to dig up a trench with the 2 steps on one side and another side. Because on Latrun, we had to fight with the Jordan Legion, the really well-armored and well-trained by British officer John Glubb, the only real army in that gang. So they had tanks. But when tank is approaching, don't try to shoot it. It doesn't make sense. Just you're supposed to lay down between those 2 steps. They will try to bury you, but they won't be able to do it. If you do everything according to the instruction, they won't be able to do it. So your task is to wait. When tank passes, you need to dig out. That's why you need 2nd step, and then shoot, because they are not really well protected from the other side. What happened, he said, my Palmachim, my guys from this brigade, who were born there, who knew the war from inside, they knew what to do. They had that Wittgensteinian practical knowledge. They did it for 2 hours, all those trenches, and then went to drink and to sing. All those yekis who looked like skeletons, they lost weight. They just came from concentration camps. They spent hours and hours doing everything according to the instruction. Clearly because they are yekis. There's no other reason for doing that. But next morning, when the fight started, all that practical knowledge my guys had, all that knowledge in hand that you are praising because of Wittgenstein, told them, run. Because here you are entrapped. They knew everything, but they ran. Some of them towards tanks, some of them from tanks, they were killed immediately. Those yekis who were writing their PhD dissertations on Hegel, and then straight from the university went to concentration camp, and then from concentration camp to Palestine. They did everything according to instruction and survived. Because, he said, practical knowledge doesn't save lives. Abstract thinking does. So imagination does. You need to go up and look at this situation from the meta position. And it tells you that this tank is not able to kill you if you do everything according to the instruction. I think that at this moment he was Misnagedim. He was a very rationalistic Jew, not philosopher of knowledge, but still works. At the same moment, it was his first disappointment with Israel. He was one of those who had to shoot Al-Talena ship. It was the 2nd time when I saw him crying. First time when he was talking about his sister. And he said, I couldn't believe that this kind of solidarity we had, that kind of newborn state solidarity, was replaced by tribal conflicts so fast between right wing and left wing immediately. Not even before the war was over. That complete inability of people to listen to one another became the greatest shock of those days. So Teodor decided to become a social worker to help people in a newborn state. He was not very happy with the situation with social work in Israel in 1950s. So he decided that he needs to know more about society, and he started to study sociology at Jerusalem University with Shmuel Noach Eisenstadt, one of the most famous sociologists of that time. I asked him once what he is thinking about Eisenstein, because Eisenstein is incredibly famous, even nowadays. He said he was brilliant, he was classical. The only problem, he did everything to become first and last Israeli sociologist. So everybody who was studying with him left Israel to go to study some other place. And that's what Teodor did. because Palmach, that brigade he was part of, because of the conflict with Ben Gurion and so on, just imagine, they were much more left than Ben Gurion. For me today, it sounds like he was expelled from Gestapo for being too cruel. It's like left than left. I asked him once, how did you manage to become a Marxist, being from this kind of family and seeing everything what's happened in Soviet Union? He said, it took time. It took time to become a real Marxist. So, but because of this conflict and because he was very loyal to Tzvi Zamir, by the way, it's probably if you have seen the movie Munich, Emi Weinberg is playing Tzvi Zamir. Tzvi Zamir was also from Lodz, also from Poland, and he was responsible for all those forged documents with which Teodor immigrated to Israel. So later, Zamir became chief of Mossad, and he was in charge for finding Black September terrorists who organized that terroristic attack on Olympic Games. But anyway, after all those conflicts and all those disappointment, he decided to go to England to get PhD. Then he became professor. First in Birmingham, he got PhD, then he became professor in Sheffield, teacher, and then he got appointment in Oxford. So that was the next world of Teodor Shanin. He moved to England, still having a lot of affection to Israel, being very loyal to Israel. Actually, once in 2007, he sent me to Israel to write a paper and called me saying that I lost my Palmach page. And for him, it was incredibly important. I knew that. So for 2 weeks, instead of sitting in a library and writing my paper, I was running across Israel, trying to find exactly the same badge of Palmach as he had in 1948. And I managed to do it, as I thought. And brought it to him. He was incredibly happy. When he died, colleagues of mine who were ordering the archive documents and everything in his apartment, they found 2. So probably he found 3. And that's how I realized that I brought him the wrong one. So it was not exactly the same as I believed it all those years. So 3 things he learned from British academia. First, that Marxism doesn't work. Because according to Marxism, peasantry was supposed to be the most revolutionary class. And it doesn't. It's not. It never does. It's probably the most conservative class, in Russia especially. So he was trying to explain the dynamic of attitudes in the Russian villages. And he published his book, Awkward Class, exactly about Russian peasantry and its political dynamics. Second thing, he realized that he will never be allowed to study what he is part of, because he actually came to England to write his PhD thesis about his family and Jewish intelligentsia from Vilna. First, what British professors told them, no, you belong to that group. You are not allowed to study it. That's why choose something very far from your identity. What about peasants? I said, what? You saw them in Siberia, right? So you can write about them. So go and study them. I said, okay, village, right? 20 years later, he will become one of the most prominent scholars in peasant studies. He will discover Chayanov for a Russian audience, for example. The funny part, I was living on Chayanov Street and his house was just next street from me. So every time when I was visiting him, he was like, by the way, the name of the street you are living? Because you know what? They believed it's some kind of Chinese guy because it's no, they didn't know how to pronounce it correctly. But the third lesson he got from British Academy, from British University, happened when he was invited for one of the dinners with the PhD students and professors. And he saw that the sign, an invitation letter, that if you have some kind of badge of honor or orders or something, wear it, decorations will be worn. And he decided to wear his Palmach badge. And he came for the dinner. He was approached by a professor who was clearly a former military guy, and with a lot of badges here. And he saw and recognized one for Palestine campaign. So he realized that that guy was on the other side in Jordan Legion. And that's interesting because on both sides were British officers who decided that they have more affection with the locals. On Jewish side, it was Charles Ord Wingate, one of the the first instructors of Palmach. On the other side, it was John Glove. And in Jordan Legion, even comments were in English. So for him, English was a language of enemy. And he saw that guy here in University of Birmingham. And that professor came to him and pointed at his badge, Palmach badge, and asked, "Oh, what is that?" And Teodor he was never a very patient person. So he was like, "This is a sign of anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist, Jewish underground brigade Palmach." And the professor said, "Wow, so interesting. Tell me more about it." And for Teodor, it was some kind of lesson of what university is about. We can be enemies. We can shoot each other. We can be on different sides of the barricades. But at the university, we teach and learn. University is always a space of metaposition. University was supposed to be, in his view, is the place where people do not know each other's political views at all, because they're here for something else. That's why it was the first ethical. When I was a student there, I really didn't know who is right wing, who's left wing among my professors. I figured it out when I became a dean. That was surprising, but students never knew about it. He published in 1972 book, The Rules of the Game. It was actually a collection of works, including the work of his wife, Professor Shulamit Ramon, and including the work of Arthur Koestler. I believe it was probably one of the last his articles before his suicide. So it was a work in epistemology and sociology of knowledge when he was fighting against Wittgenstein, of course, as a proper Marxist, but also actually played a bad role in my life later. Because talking about the science as a game, not language game as in Wittgensteinian understanding, but closer to game theory, he was trying to compare it to different fields as a different sets of rules of the game and different conceptual schemes that can migrate from one game to another game. Later on in 2013, when I was first interrogated by FSB officer asked me, "So tell me, what's the difference between sociology and espionage?" And I just finished reading the article of Teodor, and I was impressed, and I decided to be funny, which is not very smart decision. So I said that the only difference is methodology. I don't know how to translate старший оперуполномоченный, chief operational officer, was really impressed with this idea. He said, "Oh, so sociology is espionage with methodology, right? So tell me more about it." How interesting. So maybe that's where they got this idea about anti-Russian methods in sociological research. The bad joke. In 1992, Teodor moved to Moscow, and that was the fifth world of Teodor Shanin. He moved there to establish a new university, Russian-British University. By that time, he was already, for a long time, a dean of sociology at Manchester University. So he used his friendship with George Soros and his contacts at the University of Manchester to establish this greenhouse, as he called it. He really believed that very soon Russia will become a normal country. So our idea is to build Russian-German, Russian-British, Russian-French universities now. So the new generation of scholars is starting here. Double degree diploma, all professors are teaching both in England and Moscow. Each student essay is supposed to be reviewed by a professor in Moscow and in Manchester, and external examiner from, for example, for me, it was from Glasgow, and so on. So it was not Russian-British University, it was British University in Moscow, actually. And in the mission of that university, he said, our mission is to produce a new generation of scholars. They're asking, why one generation? Why? He said, because we believed that in 10 years, Russia will be just a part of a universal academic sphere, and there will be no difference between Russian universities and American ones. So it's a greenhouse. We are just for one generation here. We won't be needed very soon. It didn't work well. It didn't work well. My generation was the second generation of Moscow school. We had our students, third generation, at the time when everybody knew that it's not a greenhouse anymore. It's a castle under siege. And till the rest of our life, we're going to stay here as a night watch on the wall, because the political climate was very different. First attack on the university happened in 2012, then in 2017, when accreditation was revoked, and so on. And everybody knew that this is kind of liberal British ghetto within Moscow. But this ghetto worked pretty well for a long time, for 30-something years, which is enough. In 2002, when I was a student there, Teodor got his Order of British Empire, and British newspapers were really thrilled that the person who was fighting British troops got Order of British Empire. I love that quotation from him. Being a good teacher is easy. You just need to remain meaningfully silent and slip in good books at the right moment, preferably not your own. I remember the book that he slipped in when I was a student. It was a George Simmel book, a Lebensschauung, where he is discussing, in sociological terms, 3 temporal horizons of human life. There is a temporality of everyday life. It consists of events that are not predetermined. You could go to this shop or to that shop. You could go to this lecture or to cinema or to some more inspiring events or something. But it doesn't change anything. It's just a course of everyday life events. Sorry, I'm still jet lagged. My English is leaving. There is a horizon of historical events. We have no power upon them. They belong to another temporality. But between history and everyday life, there is something we call biographical or existential horizon. And it doesn't have its own material. It's supposed to be done from everyday life and history through the process of appropriation. We appropriate wars if we consider them as our wars. We appropriate repressions if we consider it as a part of our biography. History is not ruining lives. history is something that is supposed to become part of those lives. But also everyday life events, our everyday encounters could become existential events if they followed by life choice, by existential choices. So in Zimmelian understanding, biography is a set of existential choices that we are making out of history and everyday life. That's exactly what describes Shanin's Weltanschauung worldview. Once I asked him, okay, but this is an incredibly individualistic standpoint. It means that you are the existential style of choices you made. And what about other people? He said the only solidarity we have is a solidarity of Schicksalsgemeinschaft, community of fate, solidarity of people who probably do not have any sympathy to each other, but who made the same choices, the same life choices under the same circumstances. So this kind of solidarity, it's about Moscow School. The Moscow School, after full-scale invasion in Ukraine, more than half of professors and grad students fled Russia. And before Teodor died in February 2020, I promised him that I will do my best to reassemble Shaninka abroad. He said, please let it be Israel or Vilnius, his native city. It was much easier to promise than to do it. We have a group of colleagues of mine, I will tell a little bit about them later, who are working in Vilnius. We have a huge group of Shanin's graduates and scholars who are working in Israel, thanks to Israeli universities who helped me to get out of Russia. I guess almost 20 people who were also interrogated, so on. But it's hard to establish something there. So we reestablished Shaninka in Montenegro. We got accreditation and license from the government of Montenegro. It was much easier. However, we had to suggest to change the local law of education because there was no such thing as liberal arts in Montenegrin law. Now there is law about liberal arts in the legislation course. So we have a group of sociologists, stupid faces, yes, that's how we are recognizable. And for 3 years, I think we already worked there. Because community of faith is something that can be reassembled if people still believe that there is something that unites them. This is International Teodor Shanin Foundation, the group which I belong to. That's why Montenegro is one of the bases of Western spies and Jewish and non-Jewish liberals. Another in Vilnius, the group of people who moved there. We have a group in Germany and, of course, in Israel. And all thanks to one person. Thank you so much for attention. If you have questions, I will be happy to answer them.
Thank you so much. It was tremendous. And I particularly appreciated the gentle and dry European humor and also the personal testimonies. The jokes aside, I'll ask a couple of questions and then we'll open the floor. First is not a question, but a comment, just to say that there are people in this room who are beneficiaries of the teaching and scholarship of specifically Israeli scholars of Shanin's generation, born in the 1930s in Eastern Europe, and specifically in Vilna. One of them is my former professor at Yale, Benjamin Khrushchev, who was, of course, Khrushchevsky, who was a major student of poetics, but also did a great deal to translate and disseminate works by new Hebrew authors. Another was Omri Ronen, who was actually my late father's cousin, the late Omri Ronen, the major Mandelstam scholar, and it's the same trajectory. These are people who ended up in late mandatory Palestine or in New Israel, and then got their undergraduate degree there and left. But I want to circle back to this point. However, could you go back 2 slides?
Sure.
Because I think it's worth dwelling on one little detail. One more. Yes. So, those who know Hebrew or know Israeli history will understand this is the Shmar, which is a Hebrew newspaper with a very Soviet title, On Guard.
On Guard.
Yes, Napastu. And of course, Victor knows this, but I will explain. And this, by the way, I think is Latrun, of which you spoke. Right, so this is a very special moment, and there you have young Shanin reading a newspaper which at the time was published by Hashomer HaSair Workers' Party, which when Israel was formed in 1958 became Mapam. But, this is where I'm going with this, unfortunately, which now probably has its only home in Meretz party. So, and those who are familiar with Israeli politics will appreciate this trajectory. And so my question, I wonder if you could comment a little bit on how the trajectory of Israeli politics, of course, the European politics that Shanin was steeped in for so many years, and of course the Soviet trajectory affected his thinking and his academic practices.
I think that he was incredibly anti-Soviet for all his life because he was in exile in Siberia. His Marxism was pretty much this attempt to build a good socialist state, because the bad one he already seen, right? and his drift to the left, and he was expelled from a communist party for being too left.
Which communist party?
In Israel, he knew Moshe Sne, and I think it's another interesting story why he was expelled. Because his good friend and roommate was expelled, and he was told not to communicate with him because he is probably a traitor. And Teodor was furious because of that. He said, like, who the hell you are to tell me? So I think that Mapam is probably was his strongest identity, because Mapam is Palmach, because that was the reason for conflict between them. Gdud Avoda, okay, but for Gdud Yerushalmi, it was a very interesting moment. You remember what Ben Gurion said about those guys at Tzvi Zamir and so on. I can't say he was all his life so dedicated to Marxism, and I don't know what he would say now about Meretz. Actually, I had a conversation with him about Meretz. I said, yes, what do you think about Yossi Sarid? He said, I don't think about him at all. And another moment was when in 2007, he sent me to Israel and asked me to find his old Palmach friends, who is still alive and so on. I did it. And some of them were like very active politically. And one particular friend of him from Palmach times, he was he kept drifting more and more left, and we spent 2 hours when he tried to explain me that the future of Israel depends on the alliance of Arab nationalism and Jewish communism. And I came back, and I was giving him a lot of impressions about of his old friends. And when I was explaining how it looked like, that conversation, when I was trying okay, Jewish communism, he was very, very like depressed. He said, you know, who is worse than an idiot? And I was just like, a left idiot. I asked him and moved away because that was our regular fight. To the left, yeah. He said, no, the old one. And that was actually his comment about this political situation. But he never commented about current Israeli politics. He published an article called The Zionisms of Israel. And for him, it was kind of a very important statement. But that was published during the previous Lebanese war. So I have no idea how he would comment what's happening now.
Perfect. Well, perhaps this is a good time to take some questions, which we have time for. So questions, please.
Why did he have to learn Yiddish? He said that he learned Yiddish much later, so I was wondering.
Because when Soviets came to Vilna, of course, Tarbut school was closed.
Mhm.
And he had to choose where to study. And parents chose Polish gymnasium, where he had to fight every day with the Polish classmates. And once, because of course, Jewish and Polish kids in one class didn't work well. And once he said, he was just like answering to one of his classmates with a Polish saying, where water was flowing, it will flow again, which was considered to be a political statement saying that Soviets will go away and will be back. And his parents were told, like, please take him out of here. And that's how he ended up in a Yiddish school, not speaking Yiddish. And he had to fight every day because he was from bourgeois family. And that was a Yiddish working class school. So the history repeated. And but he learned Yiddish to fight not only with fists, but with words as well. It was class conflict, yeah.
So, go ahead. Oh, I'm Dan Epstein. I just want to say welcome, Victor. And I just wanted to ask about Russian politics. And while Teodor was in Moscow and working to build up, and he certainly saw the beginning of taking away this kind of liberal arts stream. But when would you say, what was his kind of perception of things are going in a bad direction? Was there a point when, in your mind, you think he said, oh, you know what, this is not going the way that we hoped it would go? When I came here in 92, when was that?
I think when I was a student, it was already there because he always had that feeling. But, you know, the funny part, the worse it became, the more energetic he was. For him, it was like, the things are going so badly, it's good. Because that's why we're here. And let's fight. And he was fighting all the time. When British Council was completely destroyed by Putin, it was probably the first attack on such kind of institutions. Teodor helped everybody from British Council to get to Shaninka. And then again and again and again, when the European University of St. Petersburg was the next victim. And for him, it was very inspiring, I would say. He knew why he's there. When the last crisis happened, 2017, when accreditation was revoked and so on, he said that we got to start to think about plan B. That probably one day we will have to escape together, all together with the grad students, and we need to find something. But actually, that was the year when I myself and a colleague of mine, Alexander Bashkin, came and said, let's think about opening a branch in Riga, because in Riga, it was much easier to do. And that time, it was still not too late. And Teodor even came to Riga. He actually spent a lot of time communicating, thinking about this. But when he came back, he said, you know, it's not Vilnius. When I remember it now, I was like, we had that chance to do this relocation before, but Riga is not Vilnius, so yeah, the chance was, we missed that moment. And then it was more or less inertia. We needed to fight every time for students who were arrested, for participation in political process, and so on and so on. Didn't have enough time to evaluate the situation properly.
You had a question, sir?
Yeah, just a couple of questions maybe. So first of all, since you, Victor, knew him quite well, very well, you were friends. For someone like himself, he was a cosmopolitan, clearly he was here, there, everywhere. In your opinion, in his late ages, how did he identify himself? As a Jew, as a Zionist, Marxist, whatever other scientist maybe? In your opinion, what was prevailing in his views? And that's my first question.
I think that for Teodor, that distinction between cosmopolitan and Jew didn't exist because he was from Vilna, which means that for him, being a Jew meant to be cosmopolitan, speaking 6 languages and going everywhere, having former students from LSE to Iran. So it was part of his identity. But his academic identity was never so strong because of his Marxist roots. He much more identified himself with the peasantry he studied than with academia he was part of. So it was interesting how the person with this kind of self-identification could create such a pure Weberian meta-political university where that cornerstone actually worked, because himself was much more a fighter than a normal academic professor. But he was a condition of possibility, I would say, in Kantian terms, for the normal university to exist in absolutely not normal conditions.
Which brings the next question. How can you be at the same time a cosmopolitan and a Zionist?
I think that he stopped to be Zionist in the way he was Zionist when he was young. He had a lot of strong affection to Israel and so on, but he was not that fanatic as he was before. He helped a lot to Israeli universities. He made a lot to make that connection stronger. But for him to be Zionist meant to fight with a gun, not with words. So that period was over when he was young.
That's interesting, because that was my last question.
Because you see, today, if I'm in Harvard saying that I'm Zionist, it means that I just support the existence of Israel.
Right.
For him to say I am a Zionist means you go and fight, like not on Facebook, right?
Maybe can we take another question and we circle back to you? Tom?
Did he have a relationship with Zygmunt Bauman?
Yes, a lot of. There are plenty of stories about it. One of them, which I believe is kind of a legend, how they smuggled Zygmunt Bauman in a car. But that's actually was the reason why we established connections with Leeds University, because there is an Institute of Zygmunt Bauman there. They were really good friends with Bauman.
Intellectual debate?
Intellectual debates, we don't have good traces of those, but they drink together. That's they had intellectual debates with Peter Berger. That's why we never had good relations with phenomenologists, because with his Marxist standpoint, he spoiled all possible connections with that camp. But yeah, it's interesting. With Zygmunt, he was always had a really good memories about it.
More questions or comments? Sir?
Just an interesting comment. If you talk with Moshe Shner like him, came from the Tzionim, from the General Zionist, the liberal party, old-fashioned liberal party,
Yeah.
and became a communist.
Yeah, he met Moshe Shner in his autobiography. He has, let's put it mildly, not very pleasant comments about his communication with Moshe Shner. But that's interesting how he perceived that politics of 1950s in Israel. For example, for him, war in 1948 was almost a sacred war. That's all he wanted. But war of 1956 for him was already some kind of desacralization. Why? Because he believed that Nasser is a good socialist leader. And instead of cooperating with a socialist leader who is bringing light of socialism to Egypt, we are cooperating with England and France. Well, with the colonialists, with our former enemies, what we are doing. Israel is supposed to be anti-colonial power, the major anti-colonial power of the region. Sounds ironic today, a little bit.
Two more comments. One is that this is to the right of Moshe Shner. To the right of Moshe Shner. And the picture that you showed of the Palmach was probably from 4 or 5 years after the Palmach was disintegrated. They just said the wrong word on me.
Okay, totally believe you. Totally believe you.
Thank you. Yeah. Please.
What is it for teaching Shaninka?
Sociology of knowledge and sociology of peasantry.
And the second one?
Sociologia крестьянства, sociology of peasant studies, let's put it this way. But my favorite, of course, was sociology of knowledge. So,
I was wondering where he would fit or where he did fit in the Western school of thought. Was he in the last, I don't know, 10, 20 years?
in the last 10, 20 years, he didn't fit at all. In 1970s, 1980s, he was one of the most prominent figures in the sociology department in Manchester. And there was a fight between ethnomethodologists, the scholars of everyday life, microsociologists, and Marxists. And I myself from microsociology, from sociology of everyday life.
Right.
And we had a really good relationships with Teodor, and we're not friends yet. And then I came to Manchester and met people who he fired for being because of political conflicts there. And they started to say, you know what? He is calling himself left. He's not left at all. He's authoritarian. Like, well, he was a dean for 12 years. Maybe he had a good reasons to become authoritarian. Authoritarianism is something that can save the department sometimes. But that's interesting because that time it was like real, both intellectual and political conflicts in British universities, because 1968 and so on. And of course, he was with the students, and some of his colleagues were with police at that time. And so that he really belonged to that period. 1990s, he was already not in science, but in institutional building.
What?
Institutional building Shaninka. When I remember that story.
Not in an institution, in a building. In a building.
Yeah,
institution.
institutional building. I mean, of course, not meaning he lives in lecture. Sorry, I'm jet lagged.
No, it's all great.
I remember the story he told me when he appointed me as a dean. I said, okay, but it's only for 1 year. He said, for 3. I said, why for 3? Because he said, when I was appointed as a dean, I opened up my desk and I found the sign from my predecessor. And it says, the note for the future dean, the first year, stop writing. The second year, stop reading. The third year, stop thinking. Like, you wish me good, right? So he was the dean also for 14 years.
Well, perhaps this is a good opportunity to, not to have the last word, but just to thank Victor by reminding us of, since, you know, we're exploring Jewish memory in this series, it's very fashionable in Jewish circles to say that Israel is a beneficiary of the Soviet project. I can well remember Ron Lauder speaking at a conference on anti-Semitism in Moscow some 10 years ago, and he said, we thank the Russian soldier, and then he said, we thank Gromyko for voting in the United Nations, and all of that. But
please don't say that you want to thank Putin for a new idea.
No, but I do want to say that it's important to keep the bigger story here, that of course the Soviet Aliyah has transformed Israel, and that we are in turn the beneficiaries of that, Victor. And I want to say that we're grateful for you, for your being here, and we hope you come again. Thank you
so much.
Thank you.